Welcome to my YouTube channel, Truth in Motion Studios. Today I have a truly unique guest for you because I have never talked to a chaplain in this context before. Hello, June.
Hello, Christina.
Thanks for meeting me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate that very much.
Your followers know you as J.S. Park, but I get to call you June, so that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you.
So I got to read your book, The Voices We Carry.
There it is.
There it is. And I have to say, after reading the entire book, we have a whole lot in common. But one thing, okay, if I'm being very honest, two things we don't have in common. The first thing is I can't jump over 6 or 8 people. That I'll just be honest, I haven't tried. I have a feeling I won't be able to. And the second is I will certainly never, ever forget to eat lunch.
Yeah,
Yes.
that was years and years ago. I could probably jump over maybe 3 people now.
Okay, but you would still forget lunch?
I would still forget lunch. Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, yeah, again, that could not happen to me. So I can identify with a lot, but not that. Yeah.
I got to work on my self-care. Yeah, that part, the lunch part, got to work on.
That's funny. I just read on Twitter from Kristen Kobus Dumay that she was wondering if male authors ever get asked on podcasts and such about their self-care. And now you bring this up yourself.
Oh my gosh. You know, in the chaplain training, they asked us in the very start of the training, when we were talking about self-care, if you were to number your self-care on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you neglect yourself, don't take good care of yourself, don't have good boundaries, 10 being you got it on lock, good boundaries, very good at taking care of yourself. I didn't know until someone asked me that question that I graded myself 3 out of 10.
Ooh.
And when they asked me why, I said, well, I skip lunch because a lot of times I think if I can skip lunch, I can get more work done. And then sometimes I just completely forget because I'm in the stream of work. And from that stream, I don't think about taking care of myself at all. Think about caretaking people and maybe, I guess, people in healthcare profession, for example, or social workers, chaplains, etc. We are so busy thinking about other people's needs, we forget our own. That's kind of almost a common cliche or trope.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And then there's also like, if I stop working, then people will see me as lazy or I'm letting them down, or they will perceive me as not being part of the team. And so there's this voice that pops up like, I can't stop because I have to keep going and get the work done. And so part of that skipping the lunch, there's like conscious and subconscious layers around it. I know I'm jumping very deep in on that, but I think that's probably a pretty common thing, skipping meals, skipping breaks. And I have had to intentionally the last few years get better and better at that. So
Yeah.
now my self-care, maybe 3 to like 5.5, maybe
Wow.
6.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, I hear you. And you got already very deep into it, which is wonderful because that is the message you carry. You talk about voices that influence us either on a conscious or subconscious level. And I wanted to bring up that you are a chaplain once more because I've not had a whole lot of encounters with chaplains. The one that really stands out to me is also the reason why I was drawn to subscribe to you on Twitter, because I wanted to hear more of a chaplain speak. And so when I had my first baby, it ended in this insane emergency C-section, and they just had to wheel me down and put me under. And for my husband, he was left standing in the delivery room and just like, what the heck is happening? And the chaplain came to him. And so I woke up, I asked him, what happened? And so he said, yeah, the chaplain came. And I wanted to know what did the chaplain say? Because back then, my son is now 6 years old. I was still an evangelical, I want to say, though I was already changing a lot of attitudes and didn't know that it was deconstructing. But I was looking for a formula. Like, what did he do that was so powerful? Because apparently he gave you some kind of strength. And he said, he was just kind of there. But didn't say much, and he was so powerful. Now reading, and this is so biographical and so honest and powerful and raw.
Thank you.
And yes, and relatable. Though of course I'm a white girl immigrant to the United States. I don't know a thing about racism. So that's, I will have to honestly say that's, you know, I've observed things, but I've often actually felt guilty for being a preferred immigrant. You know, even Trump said things like from Europe, preferably Norway, but I'm Germany. And when I came here, Germans were still very preferred, and maybe it's, I felt guilty for people saying, what, you're an immigrant? You're not an immigrant. And then I'd be like, of course I'm an immigrant. Well, you're not like them immigrants. And that is just something, it doesn't help you or anyone who experiences racism at all when I say I've felt guilty for being preferred just because I look like I blend in. But I do feel that. So yes, first of all, thank you for being a chaplain. Thank you for being so raw about all the aspects that make you so uniquely you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for saying that, Christina. You know, I wanted to, when you talked about how your husband said the chaplain was just kind of there, I laughed because that is sort of the role of the chaplain. I think 80% of my quote unquote job is just listening. And I have had visits where I will sit and listen to someone's story, and they may talk for 45 minutes straight without a breath. And then at the end of that, they start, you know, they're winding down their story. And then they'll look at me, and the patient will say, you know, thank you so much for the advice you gave me. It was so meaningful. And I didn't say 2 words. But what that tells me is most patients, most people, they carry the answers within them to their own questions. And what they need is someone to hear them out, to listen, and to feel that they are being heard. And that's part of my role. So it's funny that your husband said that chaplain didn't say much, because when you think of chaplains, there may be an idea of like a priest with a collar coming in, very solemn, very somber. And sometimes we're called angels of death, or like harbinger of bad news, because chaplains can be associated with dying and with loss. And we do attend those types of events for patients. But we're kind of a cross between, there's a pastor here who preaches, and then a therapist who helps with healing and recovery and mostly listens. We sort of overlap right in the middle between both worlds. And so a pastor may preach, but a chaplain is a presence. So you have the preaching and then you have the presence. So I enter in as an interfaith chaplain, meaning I can go to anybody regardless of their background, their faith, no faith. And I help that person as much as I can within the belief system that they already have, to make sense of the suffering or crisis that they're going through. So we say that chaplains are non-anxious, non-judgmental, comforting presence. So we don't come in imposing anything. We don't come in preaching anything. We don't say you got to believe these things, but instead we assume that that person, their beliefs, there's healthy parts of it that will help them to find recovery and land on a place where they can now survive and thrive and cope with the thing that they're going through. And so it's funny, one time, this chaplain, one of my fellow chaplains during residency, she came to me and she said, you know, I saw a patient that you saw yesterday. And I said, oh, and she told me, yeah, when I saw the patient, she talked about you, talking about me, right? So I said, oh, was it good? And then my chaplain friend said, well, she said that when you went to visit her, the patient, she said that you just kind of stood there and just looked at her, and that it was a little weird at first. But then she started to feel comfortable because she realized you didn't ask anything of her. You didn't demand anything from her. You were just there. And I think being there has so much power to it, right? It's not for everybody. Some people need the advice. Some people need the words and the encouragement, or the quote unquote, the preaching. But the presence is so powerful. And so that's honestly what chaplains do. It's funny because even right now as I'm talking, this is maybe the most I'll talk the whole day for my work. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk. But we make that space for people to tell their stories however they want. We validate that story, and it's in the telling of our stories that many people can find healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the context of spiritual abuse, which is what my channel focuses on, recovering, rethinking faith, I have found that you offer so many helpful thoughts. You created a model, inner voice model.
Mm-hmm.
Would you explain about that?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned earlier, the book is largely biographical, and there's also kind of a quote unquote maybe self-help slash like evidence-based stuff in there. And one of them is the internal voices, and it's a 4-part, basically a grid. And I guess the easiest way to remember it would be the initials ECSO, which is exalting, condemning, self, and others. So we can exalt ourselves, exalt others, we can condemn the self, or we can condemn others. And so probably language that we're all familiar with is, for example, when I condemn myself, that's self-doubt and insecurity. When I condemn others, that's judgment, resentment, or controlling them. When I exalt myself, that may be ego or pride. And then when I exalt others, that may be people pleasing or codependency. And so it's almost like 4 different movements, either towards myself and towards other people. And I base that a lot off of Harriet Lerner's work. I believe her book is called Dance with Anger and The Dance of Connection. And then I base it off of Karen Horney's work in the 40s or 1950, maybe. She wrote a book called Neurosis and Human Growth, which was largely revealing and fascinating for me. So these 2 women wrote incredible works, and so I want to make sure that I thank them for inspiring some of this. But when you hear the model that way, I think it's both obvious, like it's not new information, but also something that is very revealing about the way that we operate in the world, the way that we view ourselves and view other people. And so as I was sitting with patients, hearing their stories, many times with them at their deathbeds, with patients who had chronic illness and injury, I would hear these voices over and over, them condemning themselves, then condemning other people, or them people pleasing, especially when they were with their families, or also exalting themselves. So I would hear these voices over and over. And what I realize is a lot of these voices, the way we move is there's something in there that tries to alleviate or protect or heal from some sort of trauma that we experienced. So why would we exalt ourselves, for example? Where does ego and pride come from? Even where does narcissism come from? And you probably saw the new research that a lot of narcissism, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it stems from insecurity. We're protecting ourselves. There was some kind of trauma in there that made us feel inadequate or not enough. And so narcissism is almost a protective mechanism to feel like I am good. Or why do we condemn other people and control them? I think it's because we are trying to create a world that is quote unquote good. If I can make this person into this, we judge that person because they're not this, then somehow I'm making the world a better place. Most motivations of hate groups are not, I hate this person, though that can be a motivation, but instead, I know what's right for the universe. I'm going to fix it. And these people need to be more like me. That's where judging and condemnation comes from. So if you look at each of these voices, I'm not saying they're okay. I'm not saying they're good, but there's a way that we're using them to achieve some type of goodness. And so in the book, I talk about what that looks like. And then I talk about kind of finding balance among those voices.
I like that a lot about your work, that it's integration.
Yes.
We're not denying anything, but how can we integrate it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And in integrating them, I hate to say that. So each of those voices obviously have painful, abusive things in them. So there are things in there that we must discard and remove and no longer use. So I don't want to say when we integrate that they're all okay. But within those voices, they're telling us something about ourselves and about the way that we operate and move. They're pointing back towards trauma and abuse that we faced in our lives. And they're showing us ways in which we compensate or cover or try to heal those wounds that have happened to us. And in integrating, we can find balance and listen to the good part of that voice. So, for example, with people pleasing, that's the one I struggle with right now the most. And I think that's when people have reached out to me about the book, that's the one that people have told me about the most. That's what I've discovered. And so with people pleasing, it is good to serve people. It's good to want to please people in a sense that we're making sure that they're safe. We're making sure that we want people to be happy, our children to be happy. But there comes a point when instead of giving to the person, we're giving ourselves away. Right. So why do we do that? I believe it's because in people pleasing, in trying to make everybody happy, we're creating this safe, predictable world of people who approve of us so that we don't have to face rejection anymore. So if I can make people approve of me, even if I have to compromise my own values, then somehow my world is safe. So how do I integrate that part of my identity in me? And I think to make maybe a longer answer short, and this is going to come with a lot of therapy and reflection and all of that, I would say that we first need to draw our own boundaries and our own safety before trying to serve other people, and to know that that instinct and impulse and the want to see other people happy is a good thing. We can integrate that part of ourselves and know that that's a gift. For many people, that's the way we're wired, for caretakers and healthcare workers and social workers and therapists. And at the same time, we can't serve the people that we love if we're giving away all of ourselves and double booking and don't have healthy boundaries. And so how do we integrate that part? We find the healthy part of that and redeem it.
Yeah, yeah. And I noticed when people want to please others, they are not helping them to become self-sufficient. The point is, receive what I have for you if you want it or not. And then if that's rejected, then it's just leaving people in such pain.
Yeah.
Worthlessness. Yeah. So I learned in the book that it's just a short sentence, but apparently there's a whole story obviously behind it. What happened with you and the cult? Tell us more.
Oh my gosh. Yes. So I think this is chapter 10, where I talk about discerning or filtering through different voices, because there is quite a lot of different conflicting narratives and voices that we will hear. How do we sift through that? And how do we find what Howard Thurman calls the sound of the genuine within ourselves? And so to go back to your question, I drop, I think, a line or two in there where I realized at some point I was working with this ministry, and I realized that it was pretty much a cult. And I know it doesn't fit all the definitions of a cult. I know that one of them is they won't let you leave, and they'll take a lot of your money and your property. They'll in some way own you. So it didn't fit all of that. So I would have to be fair, it's probably a cult light. But what I noticed was, without, because I'm scared of pointing them out too much, because I'm still scared of them. But I will say, behind closed doors, there was never any disagreement. Everybody just kind of fell in line with what the leaders were doing. So even in our group times, there was no voices of dissent, no questions. And I noticed they had some public material like podcasts and things like that. They never really challenged each other. Just somebody would say something and they'd all agree, even if those things contradicted. It was very strange. And I noticed that over time. And so in the book, I dropped the line about where I realized it. I think there were other red flags that eventually accumulated to the point where, oh my gosh, this is really weird. And then at one point, I remember communicating with the leaders and telling them, excuse me, telling them there's a certain thing that they did that I didn't like. And so I offered that challenge, and I thought it was in a way that was fair and compassionate. But then one of the leaders called me really, really late at night and basically cussed me out for about an hour, and was really verbally violent. And that's the point when I knew. That's the point when I knew, oh my gosh, this has got to be some kind of cult, if not just a cult. And he told me, apologize to everybody. So to all the leaders, and then said, we're going to find out what we're going to do with you. That's basically what he said over the phone. And I haven't heard from them since. They have completely cut me off. And this was after he was like, we'll see what we're going to do. We'll see what our relationship looks like going forward. He had talked about maybe possibly reconciling, but I haven't heard from them at all. And one of them tried to reach out to me, but I think he also cut him off, et cetera. In any case, I know those are all little details, but just painting the picture of this was a very self-contained, insular place where no questions were allowed to be asked, no challenges made. And that's a hallmark of a cult, right? Where disagreement is frowned upon, where dissension is looked at as rebellion. And so I have since then tried to the best of my ability, recognize if there's a place where I can't disagree, where I can't ask questions, where I can't be part of the process change, where I can't look at the doctrine or dogma or theology or the philosophy in that place and say, hey, there's an issue here. I know you have been doing it this way for 5 or 10 years, but have you ever considered that this might be a problem? If not for you, then certainly for here and here, or maybe this group of people, or even just this one person. I have learned that place, I can do 2 things. One, I can attempt to stay in relationship and communication with them in order to make change from the inside, or I can decide it's not going to happen, that this place will not bend or budge, they will not hear, and I have to make my exit. And everybody has to make that choice. Will I stay and make waves from the inside, and will I exit? So earlier you were talking about, I think, church and about church abuse. I'm still part of the evangelical community, but there are many parts of the evangelical community that I am upset by, frustrated with, just disappointed by. But I'm still in that place where I think, maybe this sounds lofty or like I'm making too much of myself, but I do want to make change from the inside. I still think I can make waves from the inside. And so there may be a time when I finally decide I can't do this anymore. It's taking too much for me and nothing is changing. And my wife and I, we did attend a megachurch for a few years, and we left that megachurch and moved to a much smaller church because we thought it doesn't matter what we do here, what we say here, there will never be grace here for us. There will never be space here for us. And so that's a decision we must all make between how can I make changes. But however, I will say this, if it's a cult, run. Don't try to change it. If it's a straight up legitimate cult, don't stay.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't see that clearly usually from the inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it took me quarter of a year, no, 3/4 of a year, so almost a year, and I had to read The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse by David Johnson and Jeff Van Wanderen.
Right.
And to get the vocabulary, even to be like, wow, we can call this abuse. That's spiritual abuse. That helped me tremendously. Now, what were some thoughts, what was going through your headspace being told by a pastor you were looking up to? So someone that had some kind of authority over you because you trusted them and you trusted that they had, something God appointed over you. Why did that have the power to shake you the way it did when he called you in the night? And then how have you moved forward?
Christina, I'm embarrassed to say this, but my immediate response when he was cussing over the phone like that and yelling was that I was wrong and he was right. And I wish I could say that I was courageous or brave or that I knew that it was wrong at the time. I knew that it wasn't okay, but the things that he was saying, he was such a magnetic and charismatic person that there was a part of me that I was hurt, but there was that other part of me that was like, oh my gosh, I need to think about what he's saying. there's something right in this, right? And so there's this visceral gut part of you that knows it's wrong, right? And that's when I started thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I'm in a cult. But there's this other part where you start to almost believe the lie. Like, what if he's saying is right? Or what if I should never have questioned it? You know, who am I to even, how dare I even question this leadership? And so this phone call was also made the night before my birthday. My goodness. Or like a few days beforehand.
Yeah.
And I that whole week, I remember thinking, there's a part of me that thought, I'm so hurt. This has got to be wrong. And at the same time, I think he's right. And so moving on from that was pretty difficult to recognize, okay, it's not okay to call somebody like that and cuss them out for almost an hour. And then I think that this is weird to say, but maybe they made it easy for me because they did kick me out. They did cut me off. And I know not all cults do that, right? Some cults will take all your stuff and they'll keep trying to keep you in. They won't let you leave. But I noticed this. The next month, every month they release like different topical Bible study material type stuff. So the next month, they release something called How to Not Talk to Your Leaders.
Ooh.
And here was my reaction. I laughed so hard. I laughed so hard because it was such a ridiculous, like over the top reaction. And that actually helped my healing because I thought if they're going to be this petty and they're going to be this immature, like what was I thinking being under their leadership?
Wow.
And so in some ways, I almost have to thank them because they made that quote unquote breakup separation easier for me. I know that doesn't happen with everyone, but I felt almost lucky that as wounded and as hurt and as injured as I was, when I saw the way that they treated everything, I'm so glad that they kicked me out and cut me off. Imagine if I would have stayed. There was a chance that I would have continued on with them and moved higher and higher up in their organization. And then it gets harder and harder to leave, right? But yeah, there was a mercy in them cutting me off. But Christina, to answer your question, I think I'm embarrassed to say I almost agreed with what he was saying.
Yeah. I can only say that is the same for me too. Every time I call it mow down or the machine gun method, I ended up agreeing with them because I have learned when you fold, when you agree with them, it's over quicker. And then you get, they then can tell you,
Yeah.
that there's hope for you because you agree with them and you can be obedient and be spiritual. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. That is, it's so human and unites us, I think, that we just want to make the pain go away and survive. And when they then say, there's no place for you here, that literally means, I think, that they're hoping, that's their way of hoping that you will say, no, don't kick me out. I'll change whatever that was. I'll do that. I won't do that anymore. And I certainly have done that. And so when we finally got kicked out again, we decided this was the last time. We will not apologize. But
Good for you.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I know it must have been painful. And at the same time, I'm so glad that you stood your ground.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
And the very first fear was literally the fear for my life. I think had there been a chaplain there, or just someone who would have understood. But one of the very first things that happened was I got kicked out, and we still lived in our apartment in that town for about another month, and then we moved to my parents' house, and then came back to the US,
Yeah.
I moved to the US. My husband is American, but I developed this woman's disease. I had a terrible UTI. Oh my goodness. I had never had anything like that before. It was so horrible. And we had to go to the emergency care, and we locked ourselves out of the apartment. So we knew when we come back from the hospital, we have to call a locksmith, and it was already like in the night, and it
Yeah.
was December and January. It was just, and we had this beautiful apartment complex that had balconies toward your front door, so we couldn't even sit there because it was
Yeah.
so freezing cold. But the condemnation was almost too much to bear.
Yeah.
The thought life. What helped me back then was we sat in the elevator and just were deflated of life and hope. We were sitting there and I was in pain and all of that, but the agony on the inside was almost overwhelming. But I think because of experiences like that, I will not be able to say that there is no God. Like I can't, because what came next was so powerful and life sustaining, that's what saved us for a little while. And that is that in my mind, I prayed and I said to God, here we are, we're dying, help us. And I had this vision and this feeling come over me that God was saying, I'm running to your rescue. I'm something like that. And it just took over. And I said that to my husband, and somehow they gave us some strength to keep going. But the condemnation is that powerful. How have you either counseled people, or have you experienced this for yourself in the aftermath?
Yeah. Christina, first, I just want to say I'm so sorry. That's, a hard experience that you went through. And hearing it really hurts my heart. And I hurt with you on that. I think there's something about trauma and, those who condemn. Well, I'll put it this way: condemnation can cause trauma, right? So when someone calls you a name, a mean name, or someone discourages you, or someone says you don't belong here, or even illnesses and injuries can cause a certain type of condemning type trauma, because we can start to believe that the things that happen to us and the negative things that people say to us, that those things are true. And trauma, even things that are not our fault, uh, disaster, disease, car accident, um, those things can start to persuade us somehow that we are what is happening to us. Did I deserve it? Was I weak somehow? Did I make the universe upset with me? Is God punishing me? And so the things that people say and the things that happen to us, it has a way of internalizing to the point where we feel like the things that are happening to me are me. And when life gets bad, I'm also bad. And so the work and undoing some of that condemnation is recognizing that when life gets bad, it doesn't mean that I am. Now that's a very difficult journey to get through, right? And that's not to dismiss the pain. That's not to say the pain isn't real, but it is to say that the pain does not devalue us, and it says nothing about our dignity or who we are or the image of God that we bear. And so when we're seeing all this racism right now, we're seeing mass shootings, we're seeing racialized trauma. For me, racism has continues to have such a way of getting trapped in my bones and weaving this story and this voice telling me you're no good because of your race. It's because of who you are. It's because of your skin. And the way that people see you and perceive you, they're right. You're invisible, you're nothing, you're nobody, And I have to separate out that someone else's racism actually doesn't say anything about me as a person. And it's author Min-Jin Lee who said, the shame of racism, it belongs to the racist. It's not my shame, right? It belongs to the racist. It belongs to those racist structures. And so there's a long, arduous, difficult process of therapeutically and spiritually and emotionally getting through the work of saying, even when I fail, I'm not that failure. That's an event that happened. It's not me. Even when trauma occurs, or someone says something condemning, or a teacher in third grade told me that I was not enough, or right before I left the house, my spouse said something kind of mean to me. And, you carry that with throughout the day. First of all, I think those kinds of condemnations, we need to have some kind of justice or action around that, right? So the racism, or when someone says a mean thing, there needs to be somebody who holds that person accountable and to tell them, hey, you can't say it. You can't say that. I'm not okay with it. But trauma can happen from anywhere, not our fault. It can happen through events. It can happen through disease and things like that. So in all of that, there's our work, our internal work of being able to separate the thing that happens from who we are. And so that's through therapy, that's through being relationally reminded through friends and through good people and through community. For me, I take antidepressants, and I also am in therapy. And so I work through a lot of my own trauma. I'm a 9 out of 10 on the ACE score. ACE score is adverse childhood experiences. It's a score about how much trauma you've received as a child. A 9 out of 10 is very high. But all of this work is for me to be reminded I'm still a beloved child of God. What has happened to me is not me. And can we be reminded again and again, what has happened to you is not you. You still have dignity apart from the things that have happened to you.
That sounds incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's hard work, really, really hard work. And it's a lifetime work. I know it can't be done in a day, but it's just daily reminders. Can we do the work? Yeah.
How has your faith played into your healing?
Well, this is not a statement on those who have different belief systems at all. I can only speak for me in that part of the gospel, the Christian gospel, tells me that there is a permanence called grace. And grace is not contingent on things that have happened to me or things that I've done. That there is a God who permanently sees me through the eyes of love and of affirmation, and it doesn't change. And that is a fixed anchor, that is a fixed state that is not conditional. In fact, it's counter conditional. And people will sometimes say, like, oh, if you just say that, if you say God's forgiving, or if you say God's always like that, then how will you ever be accountable? But accountability also comes out of the permanence of that grace, that God would love me so much that of course I would want to be accountable to myself. That leads me into justice and into accountability. And so part of the healing is God's mind is already made up about me.
Oh, beautiful. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That God says, okay, you've gone through some stuff, and hey, you've done some stuff. But God's word is enough for me. And I know that when I say that, when I'm depressed or when I'm going through something, that's not always a comfort or consolation. Like, I don't immediately say that and then I'm cured.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, you hit rock bottom, and then you can fall through that, and you can just keep falling, especially with trauma and condemnation, you can keep falling. But what I find is that every time I hit the bottom, at the bottom further still is the voice of God and the grace of God, that it's permanent, that it's always there. And the comfort to me is God is always with me, and that nothing can separate us from the love of God. That's Romans 8, right? And so that's the thing that I'm reminded of. And even if it's just a tiny little bit of faith, that's what I hold on to.
Yeah. Yeah. What does that mean? Nothing, not even myself.
Right.
Wow. That's pretty huge. Yeah. The topic of listening to people is obviously a huge topic in your book, in your program to become a chaplain. And I've also heard about it for the first time, that listening to people without giving advice was made a big deal in both, one in a Christian setting and one in a non-Christian setting. The Christian setting was the theophostic prayer ministry. That was kind of a way of letting people talk and then trying to help them meet God in their trauma. And where's God in the story? And we took a guided prayer meditation. That was the first time that I was told, don't try to cure the people, listen to them, and then facilitate a meeting between them and God in prayer. Then the other in motivational interviewing. The very first quote in that book is that it goes something along the lines of, I've been never more honored than when someone listened to me. Yeah. So how would you share what you carry, both the need to be heard, but also the understanding that that applies to everyone? So the ability to, the willingness to listen, how would you share, how do you teach that to people?
So I think I can answer that question by first bringing up, why is it so hard to listen? Because it is difficult to listen. And I think each of us, we carry obstacles that prevent us from listening that, in my opinion, are not bad things. So when we give advice to somebody instead of listening to them, my optimistic explanation is that we give advice to that person because we care about them. We want to maybe fix it somehow. And also in our own discomfort, when we hear somebody's problem or issue, in our own discomfort, it's hard to sit with a person's pain. And so we immediately jump in with some kind of solution. We fill that space and that silence. And so I think for me, when I find that it's difficult to listen, or I find people who can't listen very well, I want to be optimistic and just think, okay, this is all that they know. They don't know any better than to just, it's okay to be silent. They're trying to help. They're trying to give advice. They're trying to fix it. But what I've had to, the way to cross that obstacle is for me to know, I don't need to fix this person. I don't need to jump in with advice. It's because I care about them, but that's not what they need right now. That is not their need. And so that reminds me constantly, when a person is telling their story or venting or sharing what's happening in their life, sharing their experience, for me to pause as long as I possibly can stand it. And then even more than that, right? What I've noticed with patients is that when I sit with the patient, they're telling their story. Sometimes they get to a point where they finish their sentence. And then I sit there and I might make a nonverbal affirmation, or, I just kind of go like with my face, a gesture, or just kind of, a noise that I've heard them. And then I won't say anything. And there might be 5, even 10 seconds of silence. That's a long time. And then the patient will then pick up the talking again, the dialogue, the conversation, and then go even deeper on something and get into something really, really deep that they would not have had the opportunity to do if I just responded right away. And so a lot of times I've noticed that if I can wait an extra beat or two, if I can wait just a little bit longer, sometimes that's a trick because, psychologists will talk about this, therapists, they say it gets so uncomfortable that the patient or the client feels like they have to speak, right? But I've noticed sometimes, you ever had that moment where somebody's sharing their story and then there's a second and then you talk and they talk kind of at the same time. Yeah. And then they go, oh, I'm sorry, you go ahead. So when it gets caught like that, that person suddenly feels like, oh, I'm done. I can't say anymore. So I'm trying to remove that kind of awkward clashing and offer enough space to where that person can feel like, I'm going to expand on what I just said and go even deeper because this person is listening to me. They're making that space, whether they know that or not. Their body feels like it's drawn out to be able to speak. They feel comfortable to speak. And so, earlier you said, or the part 2 of that question is to listen, but also to be heard. I think it's Carl Rogers. I think I quote him in the book, who said, when you listen to someone or when you're heard, it's not that your problem is fixed. It's not like suddenly everything gets better, but suddenly what seems insoluble becomes soluble, right? Suddenly what seems so cloudy and confusing in a fog, it suddenly seems like it's open and that you're able to move on through the thing that is happening. So obviously, if I listen to someone, I'm not really offering them advice or a solution. They may need that. But instead, when we tell our stories, I believe it's author Barry Lopez who said, our stories have a way of taking care of us. And so when we can tell them, when we can start to solidify the landscape of what's going on in our mind and in our hearts, we start to form this very solid, almost tangible timeline of, now I can see what the future looks like. The reason we tell a story is because we're stuck, because there's something lodged here and we need to express it. And once it's expressed, it's almost like, now I can see that all these things that were keeping me here and suppressed, it opens up a little bit. There's breathing room. And so that's not every time, and that's not a magic trick, and that's not something that's technical. There's an art form around it. There's no like one perfect way to do that. But I know that when I'm heard, I suddenly feel lighter. I feel like a burden has been lifted. I feel like that there's a way forward. And most importantly, I know that somebody cares about me. I'm not alone in this. Somebody hears me. And my story is not just held this way. I quote Zora Neale Hurston in the book, but she says, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story.
Mm.
Right. So I have to add on to that, not to add on to her, but by extension, there's no greater freedom than telling the untold story. Right. And so there's power in being able to listen and being able to be heard. And whoever's watching this, if you get the next encounter that you have, I'm going to show you, Christina, one trick that I do when I listen.
Yeah.
When I'm with a patient, very often, I know now we have masks and it's different, but let's say you're face to face with someone. I will sometimes just kind of put a hand closer to my mouth. And this is a reminder for me that this is their talking time. Or since we're having masks now, I'll kind of keep my hands closed, almost in like this personal prayer or meditation type position. And it's like when I feel like they're winding down, I'll start to kind of release a little bit. And that's the cue for me, the physical cue for me. Okay, now I can come in and ask them a question or remark on their experience or validate what they're saying. So I think for each of us, there needs to be some kind of posture or method or way to remind ourselves, this person's talking. It's time for me to listen. I'm not going to jump in. I'm not going to interrupt. I'm just going to let them be who they are.
Yeah. Wow. You said obviously wonderful things. And the thing that I think we often don't think about is that the first thing you said about why we feel like we need to fix people, because we can't bear the agony or the suffering that we pick up on. So we have to fix it. And that is such an important reminder. One sentence probably won't fix it. Sometimes one sentence damages, or one sentence, you mentioned in the book the beautiful story of that someone wrote you a note that you had prayed with them, and this one sentence saved them probably from suicide. Yeah. So it can be that powerful. Yes. But that was really a sacred moment that often it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I think a good question to ask is, what does this person need? So sometimes they need listening. In fact, I would say most of the time they need listening, but sometimes they do want advice. I've had patients ask me, like, what do I do now? Or how do I handle this grief? Or where do I go next with this? And in those cases, I'll offer something. But even then, as much as I possibly can, I want to offer them, you used the word earlier, I think, self-sufficiency. How can I empower this person? Because they probably already carry the answers to their own questions. Most of the time they do, right? And so how can I answer in a way that, yes, I'm answering their question, I'm not being weird or like, in the middle about it, but I'm handing them the reminder that you have the ability to do it. You have the grace to do this. And can I give you the reminder of who you are and a reminder of the strength that you actually carry? And so, again, I don't want to make a general blanket answer for that. Some people really do need the knowledge and the help and the resources, and I'll pull up things for them if they need that, or sometimes I need to go to somebody else to ask for that advice to give it to them. But most of the time, I would say people do have the ability and the grace to be able to survive and thrive and find the resilience to cope with what they're going through.
Yeah. Can we talk about Christianity and racism? Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. Nothing's off the table. Let's do it.
Asian hatred is in the news right now, and as hard I'm grateful that it is being spoken about. Here's something I observed a little while ago on a Facebook encounter. A former client of mine, I'm a personal trainer too, so she posted a Asian woman who was doing tricks with a scarf. And it was just awesome. Like, it was this super short video of turn it this way and it's completely different. And so it drew me in. I looked at the video, and so then I looked at the comments that were under my clients or former clients post, and there was this woman who had just posted, "They look ugly," and I posted back and I said something like, "What the heck? What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, that's the truth to me." And then I looked on her Facebook page, and here it is. She clearly claimed to be a Christian. She made, there were Christian signs over her Facebook page and banners. I was this close of calling her a racist, but I don't think I was brave enough. But I wanted to get her to think that, how can you make a statement like that? It's just, it was, I felt bad for the whole thing, and it just is awful. How would you wish I would have reacted, or how would you wish Christianity deals with this?
Oh. Well, I'm sorry to laugh. I don't mean to laugh at what you just described. I think the laughter is more of a kind of, it's just such a big question to cover. But
Again,
I can,
sorry.
yeah, I'll say two things on this. One is, I believe that when possible, if we can intervene, we are called to do so. Online, in public, any place, in the workplace, at home. If we can speak up, we are called to do so. And I also want to make sure I'm holding grace for those who, because of mental health, because of your own safety and comfort, intervening can be difficult. And especially online, there are a lot of times that I see terrible comments that I want to say something, but I know that for my own mental health and safety and comfort, and also not wanting to get wrapped up in a crazy, terrible argument that'll only just make me angry and frustrated the rest of the day, I look at those case by case, and I have to decide, will I intervene and say something, or will I pull back? Can I say something and then just leave it alone and let that person deal with the thing that I intervene with? So it's a choice that each of us make. Now, if we see a situation on the street, I think it's kind of the same thing, where there are ways to safely intervene, and then there's also, oh my gosh, this is a bad situation, I'm going to have to somehow get the authorities involved, though, as we know, getting the authorities involved doesn't always work out either. But yeah, to answer that question, I think intervention is something that we must choose each moment how we are going to step in. And maybe for you in that moment, it was better if you said something and you were about to say a little bit more, but you decided, not right now. It's not for me right now. And I think that's okay. It's kind of your comfort level. I do recommend, there's an organization called Hollaback. They do bystander intervention courses. And the one that they're offering is specifically for the AAPI community, Asian American Pacific Islander. I took the course last week. Fantastic. And they give 5 different ways that we can safely intervene when we see someone being a victim of racism. And so I thought that was really great. It's both for online and if you see it in public. So I recommend that to anybody who's watching, listening. It was very helpful. But to answer your other question about Christianity, I think we probably need to separate, here's Christianity, what I believe the Christian gospel to be, that God loves and that God particularly looks out for the vulnerable, at least 7 groups of people, the widow, the orphan, the poor, the sick, the grieving, the prisoner, and the foreigner, right? All throughout scripture, we see God blessing them, pouring out to them, saying, you need to look out for them because of their needs. These are groups of people that have specific needs because they've lost so much. So that's the Christian gospel. You have Christianity, and it does speak to race and racism. Then you have church, right? And what we see in particularly the American church, the evangelical church, is some kind of fear slash anger slash feeling threatened about the topic of racism. And I think that can be wrapped in many different layers, but I think a lot of it has to do with nationalism creeping into churches. I think that could be power structures. I think that could be leaders, particularly those who are not people of color, who are feeling threatened because they're being called to repentance and to action. And so they want to turn away. Because most people, when they're confronted with the possibility that they have been racist, people who feel threatened that, oh, all along I've been complicit in this racist structure, suddenly they have to go from, I've been a good person, a good Christian, to, oh my gosh, I've been complicit in violence with my silence. I was participating in this status quo. And, earlier we talked about the voice of ego or pride. What is that used for? That's a self-protective mechanism, because many of us have a stable idea of ourselves that can't be threatened and can't be shaken. Because suddenly when we look inside and realize, oh my gosh, there's actually quite a lot of silence and complicity that I was a part of, it's threatening to the ego, right? And so I think for some reason, and we can get into those, maybe there's a whole different conversation, but it seems like Christians and Christian leaders and evangelical churches have a hard time with reckoning with the racist history of the evangelical church, the American church, and with the possibility that they have perpetuated silence and violence with racism. And so right now there's a reckoning happening with the American church, with the evangelical church, that yes, the practices that you had, the power structures that you keep, the leaders that you're keeping in power, the pastors that are there, probably perpetuating racist powers and structures. And a lot of Christians want to be in denial about that, are scared to admit it. So my hope is that the Christian core value, the gospel, will shine a light with both compassion and justice on the mainstream evangelical American church, these pockets where there is fear of confronting that. And it would, the gospel would actually break them open, and that they would see, oh my gosh, I have been complicit in this. I have, with my silence, perpetuated racist violence. What can I do to be the hands and feet of divinity here on earth? What can I do? Instead of running scared, running into it. Instead of running away, running into the fear and the pain of that. I, as a male, I have certain privileges. And I think there probably was a time also as an Asian American that I could look away from the Black community and the pain that they're experiencing and going through. I say that to my own shame. I'm sure that I had privilege enough to be able to look away from it. But when the gospel broke me open to see people who are in need, to see people who have lost, I can't look away from it anymore. I can't. And so I see the pain of the Black community. I see it now with full eyes, and it hurts. And I hurt for them and with them. And so I know for some people that's uncomfortable and that's painful to reckon with our own racist legacies and the way that we have perpetuated it, but we got to reckon with it. And then we need to ask, how can I enter in now? There's time lost. The time is gone, the time that I wasn't doing it. But now, right now, how can I enter in and begin the work of accountability and justice?
It reminds me of the story in your book where these girls that gave you the ugly pass in 6th grade,
Yeah.
how in tears they apologized to you. And then your reaction as a 12-year-old, you wanted to give them a hug. You offered a hug and they ran away.
Yeah. In 6th grade, I got an ugly pass from these two girls. I changed their names in the book.
Sure.
But the ugly pass was, you can show your ugly face at school today, and I'm 12 years old. Of course, that was extremely hurtful and harmful, may have been due to my race, but also just, kids can be mean. Yeah. And then at the end of the year, they did apologize. And the story behind that is, on the last day of school, the teacher asked us, what did you learn throughout the school year and what was your experience like? Like she opened the class up to do that. And I raised my hand and I shared for maybe 5 minutes. And I said, I said something like, when I first got here, nobody liked me. And I felt like everybody hated me and I had no friends. And by the end of the year, I didn't make a lot of friends, but I made a few. And I started to feel like maybe I'd be okay. I said something like that. That was kind of sad. And, for a 12-year-old, it was about as deep as I could go. And these two girls, when they were listening to me, I noticed that they looked like they had tears in their eyes because they realized they had contributed to the pain that I experienced for my entire sixth grade year. And so they came to me and they apologized. And, when I went to hug them, of course, anybody can turn down a hug. That's all based on our own consent. And maybe they weren't huggers or something like that. But when I went to hug them, what I noticed was I think they felt shame in not being able to receive that restoration and reconciliation, like shame at what they had done. And that I was so willing to just say, it's okay about the whole year, you know? And I think sometimes when people get that kind of response from someone that they've hurt, you get a mirror on, oh my gosh, I can't believe how bad I was and how loving this person is. And I know I sound like I'm bragging, like I'm the loving person, but really there can be something where it's like a shame about how we weren't there or we didn't do better. And even with friends that I have now, I still feel that shame, especially the Black community. I've been again, this sounds like I'm bragging by proximity or something, but I truly, really have been friends with so many people in the Black community for years, but I didn't really understand the pain that they were going through until maybe, around the 2010s or so, maybe 10 years ago, a decade ago. And so there's a shame in me that they've been so kind to me and so generous and so gracious to me, and yet I didn't fully see what they were going through. And so there's still that guilt, but I think I say all that to say, what can we do now? What can we do now? That time gone is time gone, but from now on, what can we do? So yeah, I remember that. And maybe if I saw those two girls again, it would be different. I don't know. And again, anybody can turn down a hug. That's fine. But yeah, when we are met with that, there's that feeling of almost a mirror being held up, like this of shame. And at the same time, I hope we can make a way for that reconciliation and restoration.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like whatever I say now, I will not do it justice.
Yeah. Well, Christina, can I say I'm so thankful to you for allowing me to be interviewed by you and to share about some of my own experience and pain. And I think what you're doing is wonderful, that you're bringing awareness. And I hope that it's awareness that makes us come alive with action, and that people would see. And when they listen, not just hear, but also offer the gift of belief. That when a person is sharing their experience of pain, we don't just, okay, I heard you and now I'm going to go on with my day, but rather really listen. And by that listening, can we act on that awareness and come alive with action?
Wow. Yeah. People can follow you on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook.
Yes.
You have other books too, so there's a lot to dig into. You are as fascinated by June as I am. So thank you so much for being here with me during this hour.
Yeah, Christina, thank you. And I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.